This video is an overview on formulating research questions, and in particular when you look at the marking criteria for your assignments, it talks about the formulation of research questions and how they need to be linked to real-world context and to inquiry design. And so what I'm going to cover in this video and this PowerPoint is how that works and how you put that together. So it's important to realize that the context in which research is done defines the research purpose, and this then affects the style of research questions that might be asked, and the style of question then determines whether it could be considered a testable question, that is testable via the generation of an hypothesis. And if it's not, it may lead to some other form of questioning that could be investigated scientifically from some other perspective. And so it's that style of question embedded within the context and the research purpose that determines the type of science inquiry design. So, what are we talking about in terms of context? We're looking at we could be looking at lab science with non-living things, chemicals for example. We could be looking at lab science with plants or lab science with animals. We could be looking at field science in sensitive environments where we can't actually do much interference with the environment in terms of manipulation, and therefore we have to stand back and study it without touching the environment. We could be looking at astronomy or climate change science or clinical health science with humans, or even science classrooms and children as our topic of study. And so as you can imagine, the type of science that could be conducted across these different environments, across these different contexts, is going to be different because of the nature of what we're studying, and also ethical and safety and technological issues involved with these various contexts of study. So out of this we can come up with a range of different purposes of a particular science inquiry. And the ones that I'm looking at in this unit are the purposes of identification, of description, or of exploration, which usually involve complex phenomena that have not been previously studied or are on a scale that makes their study too difficult. And astronomy is an example of that, or some aspects of clinical health research with humans is an example of that. Another category that we look at in terms of purpose is the explanatory purposes, and these arise where we can define variables but we don't know much about their relationships. So we could probably measure or easily identify things, but it's explaining how they fit together. The next one is predictive purposes, and these arise where we can define variables and we can study and measure them and measure their relationships in some detail. But quite often we can't control those variables. So we are, in predictive purposes, we're looking at understanding those relationships better, but we have better ways of measuring things, which makes it a more rigorous form of research in relation to the quantitative nature of it. And then the final one there is control as a purpose, which is where we can actually control all the variables and actually determine a cause-effect relationship. And as you can see in this table, I've provided these categories, an example of the sorts of questions that you could expect to derive from those purposes, and then linking that to different types of inquiry design. So these are the inquiry design types that we're going to look at in this unit. Observational, comparative, perturbation, correlational, and controlled experimentation. So as you see, there's a bit of overlap across these purposes and the inquiry design, but there is a trend in the direction and the types of science inquiry that they use. Another way of looking at types of science inquiry is to think about them in terms of qualitative and quantitative research. And once again, you'll see that the qualitative styles of research tend to be at that identification level. There seems to be a mix of qualitative and quantitative types in the middle, and we move towards the quantitative as we get closer to a controlled experiment. So that's another way of thinking about inquiry design. But there is no a natural hierarchy of science inquiry design. You'll see in some education literature, you'll see it quite explicitly in the health and medical sciences, that they describe science as a hierarchy of quality research. That is not a natural hierarchy, it's a hierarchy made for, let's say, professional and political purposes in particular disciplines. The important thing to take out of science inquiry is that the science inquiry must fit the purpose. So it's a bit like science inquiry design being a technique or a tool which must match the job at hand. There's no point doing a controlled experimental design on looking at the cause and effect of climate change because you can't replicate the Earth and control all of the variables. You have to use other techniques and other forms of science inquiry to solve that problem and that context. So that's a way of approaching this. So when evaluating scientific inquiry, we therefore need to look at the coherence of the inquiry design. That is there a good fit across the context, the purpose, the question style, and the inquiry design? And you'll see in the marking criteria for your assignments the word coherence, and that's what I'm referring to in relation to justified research questions. Now, to help you with some of this, I've introduced this theory of measurement. And this is something that is introduced in Year 9 mathematics curriculum under the Australian curriculum. So students in schools from Year 9 upwards will have some familiarity with the ideas here. It may not appear in this format, but it's these scales of measurement, which you see on the left here, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, that kids are taught in mathematics. And this is the sort of thing you can bring in to help in the design of research questions, because the sorts of questions you ask and the sorts of data you collect and the sorts of quantitative or qualitative analysis that you do will be determined by the type of scale that you use to measure particular variables. So you should be trying to use ratio wherever you can, which is measures of physical things have an absolute 0 point, things like length and mass and so on. Where you can't do that, interval is another option, not quite as good because of the limitations in the statistical methods that you can use, which are on the right hand side over here. So ratio have unlimited statistical methods to be applied, whereas interval, you can pretty much use mean, standard deviation. You can put interval data into linear models, and you can use correlational statistics as well. So interval data is not too bad. It generally involves a arbitrary 0 point. Examples of that are temperature in degrees Celsius. The next one is ordinal. So things such as classifying things as short, medium, and tall. So there is an order in those three descriptors. So things are being determined whether they're greater or less in that order, but that type of data cannot be added together and averaged. So we can't add up the number of people in short, medium, and tall categories and come up with an average height. It limits us in statistical terms to measuring the middle of the data using the median and looking at percentiles within each one of those ordinal categories. And then finally, nominal data. So this is just categories, things like male and female, black and white, up and down. So very broad categories, and it's looking at equality between groups. So we can do very, very limited statistics with that sort of data. We can't add up the number of males and the number of females and say that the average is somewhere in the middle, because you're either one or the other. So the statistics you use in that sort of measurement are things such as the number of cases in each category, the percentages in each category, and we can look at a simple measure of the centre of data in terms of mode if we've got a distribution. So these are things to think about when you're defining variables and how you're going to measure those variables, and thinking about then techniques or science inquiry methods that can get you collecting data that's closest down towards the ratio level of measurement as possible. That concludes this video. There is an activity on this topic in the Blackboard site, so we'll have a look at that in the workshop.